Welcome to this explainer. We are diving straight into June 28, 1919, stepping right inside the legendary Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. You know, to really grasp this moment, you kind of have to appreciate the sheer historical pettiness at play here. The French specifically chose this breathtaking, opulent room to utterly humiliate the Germans. They forced them to sign this painful treaty on the exact spot where the German Empire was proudly proclaimed almost 50 years earlier. This famous signature formally ended the First World War, and it's constantly framed as the definitive turning point of the 20th century. But today, we're going to unpack exactly why the signing of the Treaty of Versailles is often completely misunderstood.
1919 did not guarantee 1939. It is so incredibly tempting, especially when we're looking back with the benefit of hindsight, to treat that signature as the very first domino falling in a perfectly straight line directly to the Second World War. We love a simple cause and effect narrative, right? It makes sense of the chaos. But the real story? Well, it's much messier, far less inevitable, and quite frankly, way more fascinating than just drawing a simple line across a timeline.
Section 1. The Treaty and its Discontents.
So, what did this treaty actually mandate? Well, it basically dismantled the old global order. It completely redrew the map of Europe, severely slashed German military power, and stripped Germany of its territory and overseas colonies. And we're not just talking about a bruise to national ego here. By drastically shrinking their borders, the treaty stripped Germany of vital, resource-rich industrial heartlands. Throw in those enormously heavy economic reparations, and it practically guaranteed the economic doom that was about to follow. It was a total massive restructuring of power dynamics, with immediate and devastating consequences for the defeated nation.
Now, the reactions to this treaty fractured right along old wartime lines. France had suffered catastrophic destruction on its own soil, so they considered these strict terms absolutely necessary. Some even felt they weren't punishing enough. Britain, on the other hand, was pretty divided. You had the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes publicly warning that this reparations burden was economically reckless and would destabilize Germany for a generation. Over in Germany, the reaction was just sheer shock. They didn't view it as a negotiation at all, but rather as a diktat, a dictated, deeply humiliating peace. And then there's Australia. Prime Minister Billy Hughes attended the conference and furiously clashed with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Hughes aggressively demanded harsh terms, which really signaled loudly that Australia wanted a real, uncompromising voice at the table alongside the major powers.
Moving on to Section 2, Ingredients of a Catastrophe.
Historians are constantly warning us against the shortcut of thinking Versailles alone explains everything that followed. Instead of a straight line, it's better to think of it as a recipe for disaster. The Treaty of Versailles, that was just the base ingredient. You have to mix that treaty with the chronic, simmering political instability in the newly formed Weimar Republic. Then you fold in the devastating hyperinflation of the early 1920s. I mean, we're talking about an economy so utterly shattered that people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. And finally, you top the whole thing off with the global catastrophe of the Great Depression. Versailles was absolutely significant, for sure, but it was just one part of a highly combustible mix.
Which brings us to Section 3, Dangerous Myths and Fringe Politics. Now we hit a crucial psychological and cultural turning point. A lot of Germans came to believe a deeply toxic myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, or the stab-in-the-back myth. This was the completely false claim that the mighty German army hadn't actually been defeated on the battlefield, but was instead betrayed by enemies from within, civilian politicians, socialists, and others back home. It successfully redirected the blame away from actual military failure. Looking back, it serves as an incredibly sobering masterclass in the absolute dangers of political misinformation and weaponized denial. It provided a highly convenient yet dangerously volatile narrative for nationalist movements who were just desperate for a scapegoat.
And this toxic environment was a total magnet for the disillusioned. Take Munich in 1919, for example. A young Austrian-born veteran started going to political meetings and eventually joined a small nationalist party. His name was Adolf Hitler, but the really dark irony here is that at this specific moment in time, he was basically a complete nobody. He wasn't some marked historical figure. He was just another anonymous, angry symptom of a traumatized nation filled with disillusioned ex-soldiers. It's actually a massive historical error to treat his presence in 1919 Munich as some kind of inevitability that people at the time should have spotted.
Let's look at Section 4, Accumulation over time.
So, what really connects Versailles to the utter catastrophe of the 1930s? It isn't a single arrow pointing straight to war. It's an accumulation. First, you have an unjust treaty in 1919. Then, toxic myths masking military defeat, simmering right alongside chronic political instability and devastating economic ruin in the early 1920s. Any one of those factors alone might not have broken the system. But by 1929, when the global Great Depression hit, it absolutely shattered an already fragile German republic. This final accumulation of crises is exactly what handed those fringe, extremist movements the desperate audience they needed to seize power.
Section 5. Australia's New Global Voice. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to remember that Versailles didn't just break the old world, it birthed entirely new global players. Before 1919, Australia entered the war as a loyal, largely unquestioning part of the British Empire. But after 1919, the whole dynamic completely shifted. Australia left that peace conference having boldly argued for its own voice and its own distinct national interests. It was a definitive coming of age. It severed the old expectation of blind imperial loyalty and signaled to everyone just how seriously this young Commonwealth now took its autonomy on the world stage.
History almost never gives us tidy, wrapped-up resolutions, does it? So as Australia stepped out of the British shadow and into a highly unresolved global landscape, we have to ask ourselves, how prepared was this young nation, or really anyone, for the storm they had just helped seed? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the timeline, and we'll see you next time.